Spawn is fighting Batman. You heard that right, ladies and gentlemen. Now, you are either going to love this comic or you're going to hate this comic, but there is one thing I want to establish beforehand. So whenever it comes to intercompany crossovers, these stories are designed to be read in isolation. Technically speaking, Batman and Spawn have crossed over a couple other times before. In fact, it was 2 times, and they both happened in 1994. This story came out last year, at the time that we're recording this video, in 2022. But it's basically written in a way where these characters have never met each other. Now, the other thing is that because it's basically out of continuity, you can't really bring anything going on with Spawn at the moment into the story, and you can't really bring anything going on with Batman at the moment in the story. It's just kind of its own thing. But what this does here is this initially picks up with this idea that Wanda is effectively dead, right? Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with that, Wanda was at one point the wife of Al Simmons before he basically died and ended up becoming Spawn. Once he came back as Spawn, which was like 5 years after he died, he ended up discovering that Wanda had married his best friend Terry, and then all the continuity goes forward from there. The idea here, though, is that Wanda's effectively dead. And so what ended up happening is that information was more or less leaked to Spawn that there is a quote-unquote place he can go to, or a city he can go to, where he can capture what he needs in order to get his wife's soul back, which is basically the Black Beast. Now, for Batman, things are basically just traditionally Batman, right? Which is, he is dealing with the anniversary of the death of his parents, and the death of his mom largely weighs on him, and the death of his dad weighs on him in the same way, and he honors their memory by running out in the middle of the night and beating up criminals. What's different about this is that as Batman is out patrolling and doing his thing, he's suddenly set upon by Spawn. And again, because Spawn was given information and saying that, like, this guy, right, this Black Beast basically has a kind of suit and the ability to access a portal to effectively hell that can bring your wife's soul back, this is the guy you have to defeat. The big kicker about all this is that Spawn absolutely demolishes Batman, and it's not even close. I mean, it's not even a close thing. Like, it's not like Batman is like on the ropes, right, and he's barely holding his own, right? You know, he's like, yeah, I can do it. You know, just put me back in, coach. I can take this guy. No, man. I mean, not even in hell would you see a massacre like this. Batman's just getting straight up thrashed, and he does everything he can. He's like throwing batarangs at Spawn, and Spawn's like blocking the batarangs, right? Just all kinds of stuff. He's like, you have something that I need, demon. But then this is where, like, the plot devices come into play. Because what ends up happening is that as these two are fighting and Batman's getting absolutely thrashed, that Spawn steps into what's called a dead zone. And a dead zone is basically a place where his powers effectively shut down, and Al Simmons just becomes like your average run-of-the-mill human. Now, of course, Batman ends up taking this opportunity and absolutely smashing Spawn, right? Beating the crap out of Al Simmons. Now, before anybody comes along and says, see, I told you Batman could defeat Spawn, no, he couldn't either. It literally took Todd McFarlane just creating an arbitrary thing for Batman to be able to defeat Spawn. Under any normal circumstance, Batman has no chance. I mean, let's just be honest with ourselves, right? Batman is gonna get demolished by Spawn, and Al Simmons is gonna be home in time for cornflakes. And that's just the way that it is. There's no arguing that point. But here's the funny thing about this, right? Because Batman, as he's like facing off against this guy, the whole thing is being watched by the Court of Owls. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with this, right, one, this artwork is done by a guy named Greg Capullo. When DC rebooted Batman in 2011 with the New 52, Greg Capullo took over the artwork for Batman, and Scott Snyder wrote Batman. The first story arc they had was the Court of Owls. They were one of the most interesting groups that had really ever been created in the Batman mythos, which after Scott Snyder left Batman, DC promptly ruined. So the idea behind the Court of Owls is that they were literally just an organization, a criminal enterprise that had operated within Gotham City for hundreds of years. And even Batman thought they were a myth. He didn't believe they were actually real until he discovered that they were, and that they were seemingly responsible for the death of like Thomas and Martha Wayne. They had just kind of pulled all these different strings behind the scenes. So it's one of those crazy moments, right? Now here, the Court of Owls is basically, or seem to be the ones behind all of this. That the Court of Owls are finding a way to basically destroy Batman, and that they brought Spawn in to do that. But even above the Court of Owls is basically an unidentified figure that effectively told the court, like, we can grant you powers that you just never would be able to imagine having on your own, but you need to find a way to bring Spawn in, to kill Batman, that kind of a thing, right? It's very cloak and dagger and very, very murky. But focusing on the nature of this whole conflict, that initially Spawn tries to taunt Batman and actually like bring him over, you know, out of the dead zone and simply saying like, if you truly believe you can defeat me, right? If you really want to fight me, then step out of the dead zone and come fight me directly. But the response of Batman is no, right? Like, the reality here is that we're being watched, right? There is a guy right there. Now, of course, by the time Spawn looks, that guy's basically taking off. He sees just enough of him to know that he was there and to know Batman was telling the truth. But the response is that he says, like, we need to have a conversation. Now, the other part in which these guys are able to find a sort of common ground is that on the 26th is basically when Wanda and Martha both died. Is it a plot device? Absolutely. But it's what allows the story to move forward. And so even though Spawn seems to put off all these trappings, that like his desire is to basically just destroy Batman because he needs Batman's powers effectively in order to open a portal and get his wife's soul back, that Spawn starts to realize that one, Batman seems to be telling the truth, and two, that they really are both being manipulated. So where Batman steps out of the dead zone and then steps up to Spawn, Spawn doesn't kill him. And instead, the two of them end up traveling back to the Batcave in order to have a conversation with each other. And what they do is they actually kind of compare notes. And in a lot of ways, it's Todd McFarlane sort of establishing that these two characters are very, very similar. For example, Batman has his own Bat family, right? The different Robins and so on. Spawn basically has the same thing. The two of them run around in the middle of the night and they beat up criminals and so on and so forth. Now, it's not a direct comparison. Spawn has fought God and Satan and different things like that. And the level of power with regards to the various beings in his own universe, or at least that he faces off against, in a lot of ways are comparable to the various people that Batman faces off against, right? Batman does not routinely fight like Lucifer Morningstar or any of those guys, but you do have the whole Vertigo side. John Constantine, Zatanna, Trigon, all those different things. And so it's really kind of striking the similarities these characters have. More so than that, one of the things that Spawn says is that this enemy that's operating behind the scenes, that you have to step your game up, because if you don't, they will inevitably win. That sure, you have people like Superman or the person you call the Man of Steel, but at the end of the day, the kind of powers that are out there and the kind of powers from where I'm from who are looking to take over where you are right now, they will destroy him. They will annihilate him, not in the sense that they will physically kill him, but in the sense that they will corrupt him. They will turn him into a dark and twisted version of himself. And he even says that by literally showing his true face, which it's cool to see that even after all these years, Spawn's face is held together by literally a shoestring, but like he shows his true face, that like he is a demonic presence. And he's like, this is what you will become. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of taking these two characters with these diametrically opposing views, right? Spawn, who believes in killing and doing whatever he has to do in order to achieve his goal, and Batman with a stark no killing rule. I mean, sure, he may beat you to the point that you are never able to walk again, you're drinking your food through a straw, and you have to communicate with a computer because you can't talk, but at least you're not dead. So it's one of those things where it's like Batman has his own his own rules and policies on how he does things, right? You may be better off dead, but at least you're not, right, according to Batman. So it's one of those things where it's kind of cool to see these sort of opposing views. But the reality is that given everything that's going on, what they need is information. What they have to do is track down who it is that is seemingly operating behind the scenes. So of course, Batman has his method where he just kind of roughs people up a little bit, and Spawn has his message where like he breaks their jaws, rips their throats open, some guy's eye is hanging out of his head, right? Another dude's face is torn off. I mean, it's Spawn just being awesome. You know what I mean? Like just the most awesome stuff that Spawn does. But the thing about this is that their own investigations ultimately lead them to the Joker, which is awesome because Spawn meets the Joker. Now, here's the funny thing about this, right? We don't get a great big huge conflict or anything like that, but it is cool the way the Joker's really kind of portrayed here. One, word has reached the ears of Joker of Spawn. Now, it is a little finicky the way that it's handled by Todd McFarlane, because it's one of these things where the amount of information Joker has about Spawn and the nature of Spawn seems to move beyond just word reaching his ears, right? Like a guy on the street tells his friend, who tells a guy in Arkham Asylum, who tells the Joker, right? It's beyond that. It's more like the Joker, like Spawn has been around for a very long time, and the Joker is well aware of who Spawn is. But again, that flies in the face of the fact that Spawn's basically here for the very first time. So again, it's somewhat wonky. But one of the things that goes on here is that with their investigation, basically they've been informed that the Joker is working alongside the Court of Owls. And the response to Joker is like, well, they're all wrong. He's like, but I forgive you. He's like, it doesn't mean that we can't be friends though, because I hear you and I have a lot in common. And the Joker actually removes his face and he shows Spawn just how gruesome his face looks. Now, this is building off the New 52, right? For those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, the Joker did not initially pop up in DC Comics. He had like a single appearance in Detective Comics, and then you didn't see him for a number of years in DC. But then he just seemingly shows up out of nowhere. But what he had done is he had literally had his face surgically removed, and then he just reattached it using what's basically a kind of mask-like contraption. He treated his own actual face as a mask. You never really saw what all the mess was under his face when his face was removed. So this is like one of the first times that we actually see it, which is really, really cool. But the reality here is that Spawn gets tired of just how insane the Joker is, how goofy the Joker is. And so of course Spawn initially says like, look, give us what it is that we want to know. Otherwise, I'm going to tear you apart. And Joker, knowing enough about Spawn to know that Spawn's serious, and with Batman just not really seeming to jump in the way, like, hey, it's a Joker. Gotham might be better off without him, that it leads to the Joker dumping information. And what he says is, you guys heard wrong. What you guys heard is Joker is working with the Court of Owls. What was actually said is Joe Kerr is working with the Court of Owls, a wholly different person, like Joseph Kerr. Now, the other part about this is that when they take that information and they effectively leave, we get this bit of a teaser where the reason why the Joker seems to know so much about Spawn is because after they're gone, he actually ends up meeting with what's basically these miniature clowns that look like miniature versions of the Violator from the Spawn mythos. So seemingly the Violator, arguably the most dangerous foe of Spawn, and a character that was highly modeled after the Joker, would basically be teaming up with the Joker himself. Now, this is a one-shot comic. There's no indication that there's ever going to be another one of these again. There might be, but DC and Todd McFarlane and Greg Capullo and them haven't announced one. But what it does is it transitions away from Batman and Spawn, and it focuses on the Talon. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the Talon, it goes hand in hand with the Court of Owls, right? The Talon is basically the henchman, right? He's the guy that just goes out and does the dirty work for the court. Now, because the Talon is a person who is technically dead, but has been reinvigorated, or at least given some kind of essence that kind of brings him back to life, he has like enhanced strength, speed, durability, things like that. It makes the Talon stronger than Batman, but weaker than Superman. So he kind of falls into that little bit of a gray area there. But he's a very dangerous foe because he's exceedingly good at hand-to-hand combat. I would argue he's probably on par with somebody like Deathstroke. He's highly capable, right? Incredibly capable. But what he's looking for is basically one of the pearls of Martha Wayne. And the reason why is that Martha, at least in this pearl, was basically a means by which this portal could be opened that would allow the forces of hell from Spawn's reality to enter into the main DC universe and then seemingly operate under the control of the Court of Owls. Now, as we know, that wouldn't be the case. That, of course, these forces of hell have their own motivations and their own schemes. They would immediately take over the court. They would annihilate all of them. Then they would probably conquer the world. And even Spawn kind of sees that's most likely the case. But in the midst of the Talon meeting with Joseph Kerr, the current leader of the Court of Owls, that what it does is it leads to Spawn teleporting into the room, snatching up Joseph Kerr, and then telling Talon, if you want him back, come and find us. And he teleports away back to Batman, right? Kind of the plan that the two of them have created. And so following that, with these two guys working together, what they do is they arrive at Arkham Asylum, and they currently wait for the Talon to show up. Now, initially, Batman sets on the Talon, but it's really more of a temporary distraction than anything else. Because as the two of them are fighting to a degree, Spawn steps in and says, let Batman go, right? And then Batman runs off to complete the other part of the plan. And that the Talon and Spawn kind of have an initial standoff. Now, the Talon seems to know about the nature of the dead zones, that Spawn's powers basically disappear when he steps into a dead zone. And so Talon, of course, challenges him, come over here and face me if you dare. But then Spawn realizes what's actually going on, that the Talon Talon is after the Pearl. And so the response is, if what you want is the Pearl, which Joe Kerr has right over here, you're gonna have to come to me, and that you need to fight me directly. And so it's kind of a cool little moment, because at the end of the day, the Talon literally jumps into conflict with Spawn. Now, this is where the whole idea of the dead zones gets a little murky, that they feel like more of a plot device than anything else, because the dead zones, at least Arkham itself, is seemingly built on one of these dead zones. And that the idea behind this is that with it nerfing or kind of reducing and even removing the powers of Spawn, it does turn him into a normal human. But what you're actually going to see over the course of the rest of this comic is that the rules are arbitrary. That what's going to happen is there's going to be moments where Spawn is basically in a dead zone, but he's still using his powers, right? Like, it's just one of those murky things. Todd McFarlane kind of has a tendency to do that, right? Just kind of arbitrarily create rules in order to tell a story. But as the two of them are fighting, one of the things that's kind of cool about this is the Talon is, for the most part, able to hold his own to a degree. Now, because they're fighting in a dead zone, and because of the fact that it's just Spawn without his traditional powers, it's the only real reason that Talon's able to stand a chance in the first place. Because again, Talon would be torn apart by Spawn under any normal circumstance. And so realizing that they have basically moved their fight into a dead zone and Spawn's powers are essentially gone, that what ends up happening is Talon actually gets rid of his own weapons and says, let's just have a straight up knockdown, drag out fight. And so as the two of them are facing off against each other, it's bare knuckle stuff. Now, a lot of the value of this is really predicated on whether or not you care about Talon in the first place. If you don't care about Talon, this doesn't really matter to you. It's not really relevant to you. If you love the character of Talon, right, the 12 of you out there who do, then like, it's a really cool moment, right? And I say 12 because no one cares about the Talon. But the thing about this though is that Batman, of course, kind of hooking up this sort of system, right? Like working on his own individual plan. We didn't initially know the full ramifications of it. But what ends up going on here is that Joseph Kerr basically picks up the arm band of the Talon, right, which has a kind of hidden dagger, straight up Assassin's Creed stuff level here, and initially tries to take out Batman when he arrives back on the scene, and even fires off a couple of these things in order to try to kill Batman and or Spawn. But that's when Spawn tells him, take out the lights, right? Like, take the lights down, which Batman successfully does. And when that happens, Spawn uses his powers to morph into Batman and then basically impales Joseph Kerr on the spot. Now, the reason why he does this, and it's one of the coolest things that's so interesting, the reason why he does this is because not even Joseph Kerr knows that it's Spawn. He thinks it's Batman. And so when the lights come back on, the various prison inmates cannot see the actual Batman. All they see is literally what looks like Batman standing there with an impaled Joseph Kerr on his arm. Now, the reason why this happened is because it was basically Spawn giving Batman a leg up, right? Giving Batman a chance to actually live up to fear. Because one of the things to know is that within the Batman mythos, Batman doesn't kill, and everybody knows it, right? Like, every criminal out there knows Batman does not kill. It's the thing he does not do. And so it's the one thing they don't have to be afraid of. Batman might beat the crap out of them. He might beat them within an inch of their life, but he won't take the extra step. So as long as they're willing to do what Batman's not willing to do, that in turn, they will always have the upper hand. But by now basically seeing this illusion that Batman killed a guy, now everybody believes Batman is willing to kill if they push him far enough. And that's the point that Spawn makes, right? He says, like, now they'll fear you, right? Because now they think if they push you too far, you might just kill them, right? Like, that's the reality here. And he says, they'll all think twice before coming after you again, and you just might survive a little bit longer. So it's kind of a cool situation because in a lot of ways, it establishes this idea that Al Simmons is more aware of the issue with Batman refusing to kill than Batman is, right? For Bruce Wayne, he sees it as like a moral argument, right? A moral thing. It's a line he doesn't cross. What Al Simmons sees is what's on the other side of that line, what awaits Batman because of his unwillingness to kill, that it will eventually catch up to him in some form or fashion, and he'll get himself killed. It's why I've always said Batman's no-kill rule is kind of a silly thing. Now, of course, in the midst of all this, the Talon jumps back up again. Now, of course, a lot of that's because of the fact that the Talon is highly capable, has a bit of a healing factor, different things along those lines. And of course, in the middle of this whole fight, that the Talon has Al Simmons, who's back in his human form because they're in a dead zone. He literally tells him, use the Pearl and open the portal, or I'm going to kill Al Simmons on the spot. And the response of Batman is initially a bluff, where he says, like, I don't care, you just killed a man. Doesn't matter to me. He's like, but when you do, I release this button and this entire asylum shuts down. Every cell in here will open. You'll never take over Gotham City. Do you know why? It won't be Superman or the Flash who stops you. It'll be them, the villains. Now, the funny thing about this is that on the surface, it seems like a ridiculous argument, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. If the Court of Owls succeed in killing Batman, then the villains would be more thankful than anything else. Like, hey man, thanks a lot, dude. Like, we owe you one, buddy. And they team up and they conquer Gotham City. And in fact, that's what the Talon believes, right? He says, like, what about you? They'll tear you apart. And his response is, maybe, but not at first, right? Batman says, they may hate me, but there's one thing they hate more. That's anyone who helped make me. In this grand fight that you had with Spawn, and in this fight that you had with me, you literally just told all these villains who were watching that it was you, that you were the one, along with the Court of Owls, that created me in the first place. They'll hunt you down, and they'll do what they like most, and that's hurting people. You'll spend the next decade fighting them, and there's dozens of them, right? You have Two-Face, you have the Joker, you got Killer Croc, you got the Penguin with his crazy, amazing umbrellas. You have all kinds of villains here who know all the right people, and they know places that you can't get to. They'll work together, they'll work against you, but you'll never take over Gotham in one fell swoop. And so the response of the Talon is you're bluffing. And that's when Batman says, then kill Simmons. If you think I'm bluffing, then kill him, right? And while you're at it, kill me too. So I'll release this button and all these single villains will just come pouring out of their cells. And so that's when he says, then who's gonna save your mom's soul? And that's what all of this was predicated on. All of this was predicated on the idea that word would reach the ears of Batman that in using this pearl to open this portal, he'd be able to get his mother's soul back, specifically his mother. I guess he doesn't care about his father in this story, which is kind of a weird thing, but he'd be able to get his mother's soul back. But the reality here is that Batman came to terms with the death of Martha Wayne years ago. If this whole scheme had played out within like a year of him becoming Batman, right? Like Batman year one, then yeah, definitely. They would have been like, he would have just opened that portal in a heartbeat, because at that point he was still dealing with the loss of his parents and he was still trying to figure out how to be Batman while simultaneously respect their memory. But in truth, he wanted them back basically more than he ever did. But at this point in his life, he's come to terms with their deaths. And in fact, him coming to terms with their deaths is manifested in him going out and fighting crime in their honor to try to make Gotham City a better place. In effect, this whole plan of the Court of Owls is a day late and a dollar short. And so literally he just like kicks the Talon and the pearl goes flying, because what happens is the Talon ends up in the arms of Spawn and he just gets whisked away. Like literally Spawn just teleports away, which is kind of weird because they're in a dead zone and that shouldn't necessarily be able to happen. But in the middle of all this, really as part of kind of an epilogue here, that what we get is a bit of a teaser, which is to say that the Violator was seemingly behind all of this stuff. What the end goal is, we don't entirely know. And again, because this is a one-shot comic, I'm not entirely sure that we're ever going to find out, but it would be cool to see the Violator and the Joker team up. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.